Under the long shadows of Virginia's Blue Ridge foothills, where the sun filtered through the thick groves of hardwoods and the air smelled faintly of moss and burned oak, stood an old property that had aged more like iron than wood. Battered, weathered, but stubbornly whole. It belonged to Ethan McLean, a quiet man in his early 60s with calloused hands, a habit of rising with the fog, and a life stripped down to function and solitude. His home, a 2-story house rebuilt from the frame up after a storm gutted its bones 15 years ago, stood a few hundred feet away from a red barn converted into a workshop and, more recently, into a kind of ritual space. Atop the barn sat a bell. Old, hand-cast, thick-necked, and blackened with time. It was bolted to a rusting iron frame that Ethan himself had reinforced with steel brackets and concrete anchoring. The bell rang twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, and it did so not as an alarm, nor a command, but as a declaration. The day had begun. The day was done. Ethan had no family left in the state and kept little company beyond the men he sometimes bought lumber from, and the occasional retired electrician he called to verify circuits he didn't trust. For most people, that bell would have been a novelty or an ornament, something quaint or theatrical. For Ethan, it was memory cast in metal. His younger brother Marcus had been a civilian mechanic contracted overseas in the 90s, working with aging aircraft and fighting not war, but time. Marcus had sent him that bell, a salvaged piece of Navy infrastructure once bolted above a fire exit on an aircraft maintenance depot in Guam, shortly before he died in an explosion caused by a fuel leak and neglected repair order. It was not the sound of that bell that haunted Ethan. It was the silence that followed it. When Marcus was gone, Ethan bolted the bell atop the barn and gave it a purpose. Morning, it meant another chance to build. Evening, another day survived. For over a decade, the sound of the bell had echoed across the pines and empty field behind the house with no complaints from the land or the rare passing hiker. Ethan's property sat on 36 acres, most of it woodland and hilly. The only neighbor within earshot had been a forestry consultant who spent 6 months out of the year out west and kept to himself otherwise. But things change, and land gets sold. The consultant's property, a modern but austere build at the edge of the eastern slope, had gone up for sale nearly 9 months ago and closed quietly. Ethan hadn't thought much of it. Buyers came and went in this part of the state, and rarely did anyone stay who wasn't comfortable with some degree of remoteness and autonomy. Then, 2 months ago, a new fence went up. Modern, too polished, too straight. It cut across the slope with strange aggression, its black composite posts gleaming like teeth. There were landscapers, gravel trucks, and finally an SUV with Maryland plates that began appearing regularly. One morning, as Ethan was setting a weld joint for a tool rack, the SUV pulled up and outstepped a woman dressed in a pale yellow windbreaker and expensive-looking shoes that did not belong anywhere near gravel. She introduced herself with a strained smile and a firm handshake. "My name's Karen Sterling. I just moved in over that ridge," she said, motioning east. "Figured I'd say hello since we'll be seeing each other from time to time." Ethan, wiping his hands with an old rag, gave her a short nod and gestured toward the workshop. "Welcome. Don't see many folks this deep in." Karen chuckled, the kind of laugh people give when they think they're disarming tension. "Well, it's peaceful. We were looking for quiet, space. Not many places left like this." Ethan said nothing. He had learned long ago that if someone said they came for quiet, they usually meant they wanted control over sound. For the next week or two, he thought little of her. She rarely passed his driveway, and he kept his routines the same. 7 a.m., coffee on the porch, an hour of reading or drafting, then shop work, occasional hikes, and evening bell strike at 6 p.m. The bell rang, clean and heavy, the sound carrying through trees and breaking gently into the air like a ship horn on a foggy coast. He never struck it with force, just a controlled pull on the rope, the tone tempered to feel rather than startle. The first sign of trouble came quietly. One morning, he found a laminated card slid into the frame of his mailbox. On it was a printed message, polite but firm. It read, "The recent use of a loud metallic bell on your property has become a disruptive element to our household. As new neighbors seeking a restorative acoustic environment, we ask that you reconsider the daily bell tolling. Thank you for your understanding." It wasn't signed, but Ethan didn't need it to be. He didn't reply, didn't change anything. The bell rang as it always had. 3 days later, a second note appeared, this one thicker, more official-looking. It referenced Section 4.3 of the Virginia State Nuisance Guidelines and suggested that persistent loud noise might qualify as an actionable offense if negatively impacting health or daily well-being. The letter was accompanied by a chart with audio decibel thresholds printed in grayscale and a sticky note attached with a single handwritten sentence. "Please, we're trying to find peace here." That night, Ethan stood beside the barn in the cold dark, looking up at the black bell. He touched the rope gently, then let it go. He would not stop, but he would not escalate either. There was nothing malicious in the act. It was ritual. It was purpose. It was him. 2 more weeks passed without incident. No more notes, no visitors, no sound but the familiar ring, the wind, and the creak of deer moving through brush. But on a Thursday morning, as Ethan returned from the post office, he saw something that made him pause. A man standing in his field with a long pole and what looked like a measuring device on a tripod. Karen stood beside him, pointing toward the barn. Ethan parked, walked toward them, and raised his voice calmly. "Can I help you with something?" The man turned, startled but professional. "We're conducting a directional sound profile." "Nothing invasive, just documenting resonance carry." "You're Mr. McLean?" Karen spoke before Ethan could respond. "We've initiated a preliminary sound impact assessment. I'm sure you understand. There's a process." Ethan kept his jaw steady. "Did you file a complaint?" Karen folded her arms. "We filed a concern. That bell is significantly louder than you may realize." "It's rung twice a day," Ethan said. "It always has." The consultant, growing uncomfortable, began packing his equipment. "We'll finish from the ridge," he said, avoiding eye contact. Ethan said nothing more. He watched them leave, then walked back to the barn, climbed the narrow ladder to the platform, and checked the bell mountings. It wasn't paranoia. He had learned that early in life. If someone is willing to interfere with your time, they will eventually interfere with your space. And if they touch your space, they will eventually try to control it. That evening, when the sun bent low and spilled orange over the trees, Ethan struck the bell again. Steady, grounded, deliberate. The sound pushed through the trees and faded like breath. He stood beside it afterward, unmoving, until dusk settled fully and the shadows pulled back into the woods. That was his land, his line, and something deep in his chest, something long, unused, and hardened like old rope, began to twist slightly. Not fear, not anger, resolve. The first official letter came folded 3 times in a plain white envelope, slipped under Ethan's workshop door rather than placed respectfully in the mailbox. There was no postage, no return address, just his name typed in a too formal font across the front. Inside was a typed document on thick paper stock bearing the insignia of the county's Environmental Harmony Office, which Ethan didn't even know existed until that moment. The letter informed him that a noise disturbance had been reported on his property, specifically citing repetitive industrial-sounding tones emitted from a mechanical or metallic source, and that a review had been initiated to assess whether his activity constituted a violation of the county's nuisance statutes. It included language that danced around the idea of formal penalties. Phrases like, "We respectfully request temporary suspension pending review," and in the interest of preserving acoustic wellness for all residents. There was also a QR code linked to a PDF file labeled Sonic Footprint Summary. Ethan didn't bother with it. He set the letter on his workbench and stood there staring at the barn wall, expression unreadable. He had lived a certain way for decades. Methodical, reserved, fair. He didn't make enemies, didn't impose himself. And yet here was someone weaponizing structure, rules, and procedural decorum to bring the weight of bureaucracy against him over a bell. A bell that rang for 6 seconds twice a day. A bell that existed long before Karen Sterling had decided to import her values and sensibilities into the hills. By evening, a second letter arrived, this one delivered in person. A young man in a courier uniform, fresh-faced and too apologetic, handed it over like it might bite him. This letter was signed by Karen herself, not metaphorically. She had typed it, printed it, signed it in ballpoint pen, and had it hand-delivered. The tone was more direct. It opened with a line about neighborhood cohesion and mutual respect between property owners. Then it turned. She referred to the bell as a deliberate auditory incursion. She wrote that it disturbed her meditation sessions, disrupted her sleep cycles due to carryover resonance, and contributed to a harmful elevation in baseline anxiety. She accused Ethan of exhibiting territorial defiance through sonic assertion and urged him to reconsider the long-term social consequences of hostile acoustic behavior. Ethan reread that phrase, hostile acoustic behavior, 3 times. It didn't make him angry. Not yet, but it carved something sharp and slow across his patience. He considered responding, but there was nothing to say that wouldn't be used against him. Karen wasn't seeking a solution. She was building a case. Over the next week, things escalated. He began to notice subtle changes around his property. The edge of his western tree line, which bordered Karen's newly landscaped field, had small stakes driven into the soil, each with colored plastic tags and numerical codes written in marker. He knew what they were, survey markers, but he hadn't requested any new survey. She had. A subtle message: lines are being drawn. One morning, Ethan noticed that the bell rope had been tampered with. It wasn't cut, not obviously, but the cord had been replaced with a thinner, frayed line that looked identical but couldn't hold tension. It snapped on his first pull. He examined the knot. It wasn't his. Someone had gone up there, accessed the platform, and changed it. That crossed a line he'd hoped wouldn't be tested. He repaired the rope, reinforced the access ladder with a new lock, and replaced the bottom steps with a removable section he could store in the barn. He said nothing. He documented everything: dates, times, photos. If she was preparing to go legal, he would be ready. 3 days later, the sheriff's deputy arrived. He was polite, professional, maybe a few years younger than Ethan, with a notebook he didn't bother hiding and a tone that said he wasn't looking to cause trouble. He asked to speak off record, which Ethan took to mean without putting you on the defensive. The deputy explained that multiple complaints had been filed by Karen, not just about the bell, but about alleged harassment by noise and aggressive, auditory posturing. Ethan raised an eyebrow at the phrasing. The deputy looked slightly embarrassed and clarified that, yes, the language was excessive, but that didn't mean it could be ignored. He asked if Ethan would consider a temporary pause on ringing the bell while the matter was sorted, maybe even replace it with a smaller chime or digital tone. Ethan simply said, no. The deputy nodded like he expected that. Before leaving, he said, "Look, off the record again. I'd suggest you record everything, Mr. McLean. Even if it seems petty, it may not be about the bell anymore." That night, Ethan sat in his kitchen reading the original property survey documents from when he bought the land. He pulled out his permit records, the inspection sign-offs, the receipts for every bit of work done on the barn and its structure. There was no question of legality. His land, his bell, no code violation. But Karen didn't care about code. She cared about control, and she was working from a playbook that punished dignity. The following afternoon, he heard an engine in the lower field and looked out to see a white van parked just beyond the tree line on what he knew was the public easement road. Two men in clean polos were unloading what looked like measuring gear, again. Ethan didn't approach this time. He stood on the edge of his porch, arms crossed, as they set up a directional microphone on a boom pole and began calibrating it against wind speed and ambient levels. Karen stood behind them, holding a clipboard. Her mouth was moving, but the wind carried her words elsewhere. She didn't look at him once. The next morning, a new letter arrived. This one came from the county mediation office and formally requested Ethan's attendance at a Community Sound Resolution Conference to be held in a neutral public building 2 towns over. The language was gentle, but carried weight. Mediation was optional, until it wasn't. If Ethan didn't appear, he risked the appearance of being uncooperative, which would be noted in any future hearings. He didn't hesitate. He signed the attendance confirmation and began assembling his folder of evidence. At the mediation, Karen was seated across from him at a long table, dressed like she was appearing in court. There was a facilitator, soft-spoken, neutral, and deeply uncomfortable. Karen presented her case first. She spoke calmly, with the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. She called the bell an aggressive auditory relic, claimed it caused minor seizures in her dog, and submitted a handout featuring waveforms, decibel readings, and anecdotal logs of emotional distress incidents allegedly triggered by the sound. Her voice never cracked. Her smile never broke. It was all measured, polished, precise. When it was Ethan's turn, he spoke plainly. He told the truth, that the bell rang twice a day, that it had been installed over a decade ago, that it was a memorial, that he had never modified it to be louder, that he had received no complaints until Karen arrived, that someone had trespassed and tampered with the structure, that he had not retaliated, not harassed, not threatened, that he had not raised his voice even once. He provided photos, timelines, affidavits from former neighbors, even a note from the previous landowner stating that the bell had never once been an issue. The facilitator thanked them both and said she would submit a report. As Ethan left the building, he passed Karen in the parking lot. She wasn't smiling now. She stood near her car staring at the hood, face tight, hands clenching and unclenching. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was tactical. That evening, he didn't ring the bell. Not because of the mediation, because something in the air had shifted. The conflict wasn't about sound anymore. It was about erosion, of space, of boundaries, of the ability to exist on one's own terms without submission. And Ethan knew, absolutely knew, that if he didn't make a decision now, he would lose not just the bell, but everything it stood for. So he made one. He opened the workshop, dusted off an old wooden crate that hadn't been moved in years, and pulled the tarp off something that looked like an old industrial Siren, stripped of paint, rusted but functional. He had pulled it from a scrapyard outside Roanoke 15 years ago. It had been used in tornado warnings in the 60s. He wheeled it to the center of the barn, knelt down beside it, and began the slow, methodical process of rebuilding. Not for revenge, not even to provoke, but because if someone insisted on turning his peace into war, then the tone of the next chapter needed to be unmistakable. Under a sky smeared with the dull gray of early March, Ethan stood in the barn surrounded by the familiar scent of oiled metal and old pine dust. His hands moved with unhurried precision, tightening bolts and inspecting contacts on the now-restored industrial air raid siren that squatted like a relic of defiance in the center of his workspace. The device, heavy and sharp-edged with age, looked as if it had once been part of a forgotten Cold War facility, which, in truth, it had. He had salvaged it more than a decade ago on a whim and never thought he'd have a reason to restore it. Now, as tensions on his land shifted from passive-aggressive notes to orchestrated legal and psychological pressure, Ethan found that the siren had become a symbol not of aggression, but of immovable will. He didn't plan to run it recklessly or without reason, but it would ring, and it would do so with full legal awareness, with regulated decibel limits, and under carefully constructed exemptions related to landowner freedom on private property outside municipal boundaries. The siren was mounted on a reinforced tripod anchored in concrete near the base of the bell tower. Its sound cone was directed deliberately away from Karen's property, tilted toward the tree line and the northern clearing where Ethan occasionally stacked lumber. The wiring ran through a secured conduit into the barn where it connected to a timer switch and a surge-suppressed breaker system. He had consulted a certified technician to verify all connections, even secured a notarized affidavit affirming the safe installation and non-intrusive operation under state sound thresholds. Everything was by the book, with redundancies in place. There would be no mistakes, and certainly no reckless noise blasts in the middle of the night. But he would not continue to bow under escalating pressure. If the bell had become a target of litigation and suspicion, then he would respond not with silence, but with a sound so symbolic, so calculated, that any further protest would reveal its own absurdity. When the siren sounded for the first time, it was at precisely 6 p.m., lasting no more than 4 seconds. The sound was not aggressive. It was controlled, tuned, and softened by the surrounding trees and topography. Still, it traveled. The hills caught it and cradled the vibration, dispersing it like a low, ceremonial horn across the landscape. Ethan stood by the barn door as it rang, eyes on the tree line. He did not expect applause or understanding, only recognition. He wasn't making noise, he was making a point. Karen's reaction came swiftly, though not directly. Within 24 hours, Ethan received an envelope in his mailbox with a letter typed on letterhead from a local property management firm, Sterling and Klein Community Affairs, the name of which struck him with a bitter smirk. The firm claimed to represent regional interest groups concerned with rural soundscape integrity and requested a formal meeting to discuss the reintroduction of civil harmony. The tone was veiled but unmistakable. Karen wasn't just complaining anymore, she was organizing. Over the next week, Ethan noticed several changes. Small orange flags began appearing near the edge of his driveway, staked in like survey points but without official markings. A white SUV with temporary tags parked intermittently at the edge of his access road, occupants staying inside, pretending to check phones or drink coffee but never exiting the vehicle. When Ethan stepped outside and stared in their direction, they always left within a few minutes. It was not harassment in the traditional sense, but it was noise of another kind, an ambient pressure, like heat building under skin. On Tuesday, he returned from the hardware store to find a drone hovering 50 feet above his barn. It buzzed, dipped, and then shot westward. He checked his property line footage later that evening and found the drone had launched from Karen's backyard. No markings, no permits, nothing formal. She was pushing again. By Friday, the situation tipped. At exactly 6:02 p.m., just after the siren had rung, Ethan received a call from the local fire station. A complaint had been filed by a resident alleging that a dangerous alarm had been triggered, prompting fear of chemical release or structural fire. The fire chief knew Ethan personally and was apologetic on the phone, saying protocol required a welfare check and a site visit. When they arrived, the responders were friendly, even respectful, but the fact of their presence was enough to shift the balance again. Ethan showed them the siren, the permits, the wiring, the logs. Everything was documented. They left satisfied, but not before one of them muttered, "She's serious, huh?" under his breath as they drove off. Later that evening, Ethan noticed something far less visible, but more threatening. A short circuit had occurred in the breaker system tied to his barn's lighting rig. It hadn't caused a fire, but the wiring showed signs of interference. When the electrician returned to inspect the damage, he pointed to a scorched terminal and said, "This didn't burn on its own. Somebody either reversed polarity or jammed something into the feed." The locks hadn't been broken, but the window over the barn's east wall, normally sealed, was unlatched. Ethan hadn't opened it in months. That was the final straw. This wasn't just dispute. It was sabotage. He filed a report with the county sheriff's office that afternoon, not out of rage, but necessity. He handed over the electrician's statement, the photographs, the drone footage, the stack of printed letters and envelopes from Karen's various aliases and representatives. He didn't accuse directly. He didn't need to. He described a pattern, a sequence of escalating behaviors, and trusted the deputy to draw his own conclusions. The deputy said little, took notes, and promised to initiate a file for potential property interference and stalking, depending on what the investigation found. Over the weekend, the sky opened with a cold rain that turned the gravel paths to slick paste. Ethan stayed mostly indoors, filing copies of every document in both digital and hard form, installing motion sensor floodlights along the edge of the barn, and replacing the removable steps on the bell tower with a retractable aluminum ladder locked. Inside the barn, he moved with calm purpose, knowing that preparedness was not paranoia. It was the only reasonable response to unreasonable people. On Monday morning, just after sunrise, Ethan discovered a small package wrapped in brown paper sitting beside his front gate. No return address. He opened it slowly. Inside was a recording device, an old handheld audio recorder, and a typed note that read, "Your siren disrupts more than just sleep. We have rights, too." He examined the device carefully, using gloves, and played the recording. It was 10 seconds of distorted audio, siren feedback, wind, and a low voice whispering something unintelligible. It was eerie, not threatening exactly, but unbalanced. That kind of message wasn't about resolving conflict. It was about seeding doubt. That evening, Ethan spoke with his attorney again. She advised him to install a secondary security system with off-site backup, file an official restraining order request if evidence mounted, and avoid confrontation. "Let the law do the work," she said. "People like her push until you push back too hard. That's when they cry victim." Despite the exhaustion setting into his bones, Ethan maintained his schedule. The bell, now silenced for the time being, remained untouched. But the siren, regulated, documented, legal, continued to ring once a day. He adjusted the tone slightly, lowering the frequency, adding a softening baffle to prevent echo bounce. It was no longer a warning. It was a statement. Not defiance. Clarity. But the most jarring moment came one night just before the week ended. At precisely 11:42 p.m., all power to the barn was cut. Ethan, already awake from habit, saw the external monitors go black and moved quickly to the panel. The main fuse had been switched, not blown, not burned. Switched. Someone had gotten inside the external breaker box. It was locked with a pad and shielded case, and yet the lock hung loosely, sheared off with bolt cutters. This time, it was no longer about pressure. It was direct interference with his infrastructure. He didn't wait. He called the sheriff's office immediately and filed an emergency report. Deputies arrived at dawn, took photos, examined the damage, and escalated the case to criminal tampering. One of them, a quiet man named Rooker with years behind his eyes, asked Ethan if he felt safe. Ethan said, "Safe enough, but I won't stay unprepared." The deputy nodded, almost with respect. After the deputies left, Ethan walked out into the wet field behind his barn, boots sinking into damp clay. The air smelled like earth and steel. He looked up at the ridge where Karen's house stood beyond the trees, immaculate, soulless, watching. He didn't hate her. He didn't even pity her. What he felt now was focus. measured, settled, prepared. She wanted submission disguised as compromise, and he had no intention of giving either. The war wasn't about bells or sirens. It was about will. And his would not bend. Rain fell in a fine, steady curtain that morning, tracing thin lines down the barn's tin roof and turning the earth into a thick black sludge beneath Ethan's boots. He stood inside his workshop, hands deep in a bin of steel brackets, searching for a replacement hinge. The silence felt unnatural, the kind that arrived not with peace but with pressure, as if the land itself had held its breath. The siren hadn't sounded the evening before. He had decided to pause it, not out of fear or concession, but strategy. The recent break-in and the growing list of tactical disruptions suggested that Karen was angling for a reaction, something loud, public, and preferably angry. Ethan had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. Instead, he dug in, refined his methods, and began assembling a case, not for war, but for exposure. His attorney, a dryly spoken woman named Colleen Hyde, had come to visit 2 days prior. She'd driven out in her own pickup, boots still crusted with salt from the city roads, and spent 3 hours reviewing every letter, photo, diagram, and video clip Ethan had gathered over the past 3 weeks. She'd taken notes on yellow legal paper and asked questions that were as much about tone and implication as they were about fact. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're not dealing with a complaint. You're dealing with a long game. She wants to provoke a misstep, something she can fold into a harassment narrative or use as leverage in a civil suit. She knows you're playing clean, so she's trying to muddy the ground beneath you." Ethan had nodded, more relieved than surprised. He had suspected as much, but hearing it said aloud crystallized something in his mind. This wasn't about acoustics, or landscape, or even the bell. It was about territory. Not property lines, but space of influence. Karen wasn't trying to silence the bell. She was trying to claim control over the entire perimeter of interaction. Silence wasn't her goal. It was submission disguised as civility. Colleen advised him to file for a formal injunction against interference. It wouldn't prevent her from continuing to file complaints, but it would draw a legal boundary that she could cross only at risk of penalty. More importantly, it would shift the tone. Ethan wouldn't just be reacting, he'd be asserting rights. She would file the motion herself, but she suggested he also file an independent notice with the county office documenting the security breaches and installing a publicly visible camera feed on a secure third-party platform with time-stamped access. Logs. Ethan agreed, and by the next afternoon, 4 new cameras went up, 2 infrared, 2 with facial capture AI calibrated to scan for repeated presence within a 5-meter radius of the barn, gate, and breaker box. By the 3rd day, a subtle shift had begun to occur, not on his land, but in the attitude of the locals. At the gas station in town, one of the attendants, a man named Ray, who rarely spoke unless asked, handed Ethan his receipt and said, "Don't know what that woman's got against you, but the way she's been talking, she's trying too hard. We ain't deaf. Siren ain't even that bad. Heard worse when the power station ran tests." Ethan didn't reply, just nodded, but he caught the implication. Karen had been spreading stories, probably strategic ones, exaggerated claims about noise, threats, unsafe behavior, but they weren't sticking. Out here, people still understood the weight of reputation, and Ethan had never given anyone reason to distrust him. The true turning point came that Friday, when Colleen called him mid-afternoon with a strained edge in her voice. "Ethan," she said, "Karen just filed a formal injunction request against you. She's claiming the siren is a form of targeted psychological warfare. She submitted a 28-page affidavit filled with audio charts, sleep logs, and third-party acoustic assessments. Some of it's scientific gibberish, but it's padded with just enough data to get a hearing scheduled." Ethan asked when. 10 days from now. County courthouse. She's naming you as a sound-based aggressor. I'm not kidding. That's the term. He stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, watching rain slide off the metal awning like falling strands of glass. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the more rational part knew better. Karen was escalating again, this time through legal theater. Her documents didn't need to be fully accurate. They just needed to be persuasive enough to give her narrative footing in front of a judge. It was a tactic. Flood the process with so much paper and presentation that reality drowns beneath it. So Ethan responded not with argument, but action. Over the next 3 days, he worked with Colleen to prepare a full counter-filing. They included certified measurements from 2 acoustic engineers confirming the siren's output levels. They added the digital log from the timer mechanism proving the siren had never been activated outside its allowed time window. They submitted a letter from the fire chief confirming the siren did not resemble emergency signals currently in use, negating her claim of panic-inducing patterns. But Ethan did one thing more, something Colleen hadn't suggested. He had a statement notarized and attached from a local veterans group leader who confirmed that the siren was modeled after ceremonial memorial tones used during commemorative events. It was a sound of remembrance, not alarm. The following Tuesday, as the hearing approached, Karen made one final move. She filed a secondary complaint, this one to the Department of Environmental Quality, alleging that the siren caused migratory disruption to bird species across the ridge. That morning, Ethan discovered a group of volunteers with clipboards and green vests parked near the trailhead 2 miles west, logging bird patterns and making notes. When approached, one of them admitted they were responding to a regional disturbance report. Ethan simply smiled and offered them coffee from a thermos. He had already sent Colleen a copy of Karen's complaint, and she was drafting a response that included a wildlife impact survey from 3 years ago, one that showed no nesting zones within earshot of the siren. Still, the absurdity of it hit him harder than any of the break-ins or sabotage. This woman was willing to lie about environmental damage to stop a 4-second tone from echoing once per day. That night, Ethan sat alone on his porch, the hills stretched before him in muted twilight, the air cool and damp. He held the remote in his hand and stared at the barn. The siren stood silent in its mount, a black outline against the trees. He didn't press the button. He didn't need to. He had already rung louder than she could ever outmatch. Her escalation had betrayed her strategy. What had begun as a conflict over sound had mutated into something pathological, an obsession masked by procedure. The hearing would happen. The judge would listen. The papers would stack high on both sides. But something had already shifted. The narrative was no longer hers to control. The moment she brought wildlife into it, she crossed into territory so thin and fabricated that even officials began to raise their eyebrows. For Ethan, the middle point of this conflict wasn't marked by a victory or loss. It was the moment the story stopped being about him ringing a bell or sounding a siren. It became a story of someone trying to own silence, and someone else refusing to be erased by it. And that, he realized, was the first real advantage he'd had since the whole mess began. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of copier toner and lemon disinfectant, the kind of sterile scent that gave no comfort but carried an unmistakable message. Everything here would be formal, procedural, and cold. Ethan stood outside the hearing room with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on a dent in the drywall across from him, his body calm but braced, like a boulder anticipating the first hammer strike. Colleen stood beside him, organizing the binders stacked in her briefcase with a quiet intensity that revealed how serious this had become. The case wasn't just a sound complaint anymore. It had mutated into a broader dispute about property rights, environmental ethics, and emotional harm, all wrapped in the language of neighborly conflict, but sharpened into legal weaponry by Karen's relentless campaign. She arrived 3 minutes before the hearing began, dressed in a slate-gray pantsuit, hair tied back severely, holding a leather folio under one arm like a prosecutor stepping into a criminal trial. She didn't look at Ethan, not even in passing, but the moment she stepped into the room, the atmosphere tilted. There was something performative about her posture, a calculation in the way she walked straight to the plaintiff's table and placed her documents down with theatrical precision. The judge, a tired-looking man in his 60s with a thinning hairline and reading glasses perched low on his nose, opened proceedings without delay, noting that both parties had submitted extensive filings and that time would be limited for oral arguments. Karen's attorney, a lean, quick-speaking man named Beckford, launched into a series of statements about sound trauma, rural acoustic integrity, and psychological intrusion, peppering his language with citations from obscure medical journals and referencing acoustic pattern studies as if they were criminal records. He submitted audio recordings, decibel charts, and what he described as impact statements from other neighbors, though Ethan and Colleen knew, by that point, that most were just Karen's friends or associates brought in from outside the immediate vicinity. Ethan listened without reaction, letting each accusation pass like waves over stone. When it was Colleen's turn, she spoke plainly but firmly. She referenced the verified sound logs, the documentation of sabotage and tampering, the certification from electricians, engineers, and sound technicians. She reminded the court that Ethan's property was outside municipal sound zoning enforcement areas, that his actions were deliberate, brief, and within every documented limit. She presented evidence of interference, trespassing, and direct physical sabotage, and finally she introduced the notarized wildlife impact reports and the ironic fact that Ethan's property actually had a higher recorded presence of native bird species than the land Karen had converted with imported grass and artificial irrigation. The judge didn't offer an immediate ruling, instead stating that due to the unusual breadth of evidence he would issue a decision within 10 days. But Ethan didn't need to wait. He could see it in the man's expression, the growing awareness that Karen's campaign, though meticulously constructed, carried the artificial scent of orchestration. For all her legal choreography, she couldn't suppress the smell of control. After the hearing, things should have slowed, but instead they spiraled. Within 48 hours, someone filed an anonymous tip to the county agricultural office claiming that Ethan was illegally burning treated wood on his land. A compliance officer arrived unannounced, forced to walk the property, clipboard in hand, issuing half-hearted apologies while noting that no violation could be confirmed. 2 days later, Ethan received a letter from the county's Environmental Safety Division, stating that they had received a complaint regarding possible underground fuel leakage from old farming equipment and were required to conduct soil testing. Then came the insurance audit, an unexpected, unexplained review of Ethan's homeowner's policy initiated by a third party, likely nudged by someone whispering about liability concerns related to emergency equipment on the premises. These weren't attacks. They were pressure points, dozens of tiny levers pulled in concert to provoke exhaustion, confusion, or a misstep. Ethan handled each one with steady documentation, forwarding every notice to Colleen, maintaining his logs, checking and double-checking that every permit, installation, and usage remained squarely within legal bounds. But the emotional toll was real. He began to wake up before the sun again, not from habit, but tension. His routines grew tighter, movements more deliberate. The porch light now stayed on throughout the night, and the cameras, once set to notify him only upon significant movement, were adjusted to send pings for anything larger than a rabbit. He didn't live in fear. He refused to. But he lived now with a constant hum of readiness, like a soldier stationed behind the front but always aware of its edge. The siren continued to sound each evening, brief, precise, lawful, and each time it reminded him why he would not yield. Then, without warning, it escalated again. One night, just after the siren rang, a loud, high-pitched tone began pulsing across the valley. It was faint at first, a kind of ambient whine, but it grew in strength and irregularity. Ethan thought it might be machinery at a distant construction site or some kind of broadcast feedback. But it returned the next evening and the one after that. The sound was subtle enough to avoid being labeled disruptive, but persistent enough to cause unease. He searched the woods, checked his own equipment, consulted the sound engineers he'd hired before. They confirmed. The sound wasn't from his land. It was directional, digital, likely designed to interfere with microphones and irritate the human ear at subconscious frequencies. It was, in short, audio harassment. He didn't accuse Karen. He didn't need to. Instead, he filed a complaint with the FCC, documenting the frequency pattern and decibel levels. He had the engineers provide sworn statements. He logged the timing, directionality, and duration. He never retaliated. He built a wall of evidence, layer by layer, until the acts spoke louder than the motives behind them. Days later, Karen hosted what she called a community sound wellness session, inviting locals to her property for tea, acoustic therapy, and a presentation about noise pollution in post-rural transition zones. Flyers went up. An article appeared in the local paper. Her message was clear. She was the one protecting the future of the land, and Ethan, by implication, was its archaic saboteur. But something broke in her control. At that event, a woman named Margaret Wilkins, a longtime resident who lived 2 miles south and had once worked as a public health officer, asked Karen during the Q&A why she had filed complaints under 6 different LLCs. Karen tried to deflect, but the question stuck. Someone else asked why her own irrigation system had flooded a lowland nesting area the previous month. Karen smiled tightly, but the veneer began to crack. People weren't blind. They saw how far she'd gone. She had gone beyond advocacy into territory that looked more like personal fixation. That night, Ethan received an email from a neighbor he barely knew, a man named Henry who owned a cattle pasture near the Old Mill Road. The message was short. "I've been keeping quiet, but I've got footage of her people setting up audio bouncers on my property. Not sure what to do, but if you're still fighting this, I'll send it." Ethan forwarded it to Colleen immediately. Within a week, that footage, combined with Ethan's data and the FCC filings, formed the core of a new motion. Not defensive, but assertive. They weren't just responding anymore. They were initiating. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or gloat or walk with swagger. He kept ringing the siren, once, briefly, precisely, every evening, and spent the rest of his time tending his land, fixing tools, cleaning gutters, and preparing for the next move. Because the lesson he had learned through every passive-aggressive note, through every legal ambush and subtle sabotage, was that some people don't want peace. They want obedience. And the only answer to that, in the long run, was unshakable presence. By the time the next court date arrived, the paperwork had shifted drastically. Karen was no longer the sole petitioner. She was now the defendant in a case involving unlawful surveillance, illegal audio broadcasting, and abuse of regulatory complaint channels. Her composure was still present, but it had hardened into brittle rigidity. The judge didn't speak with the same patience. The questions came faster, the eyes less sympathetic. Ethan never once interrupted or raised his voice. He didn't need to. The silence between her words had begun to reveal more than the words themselves, and outside the courthouse, in the chill of the late morning sun, as they waited for the next set of motions to be read, Ethan stood alone, gazing out over the parking lot where the hills began to rise again. The air was quiet, not peaceful, but ready. The war wasn't over, but it was no longer being fought on her terms. By the time the final court date approached, the landscape had shifted in ways that no spreadsheet or acoustic chart could fully explain. Ethan's once quiet existence had been fractured, reshaped into a terrain of prepared statements, legal counters, and long nights spent reviewing digital footage frame by frame. But beneath the exhaustion, there now rested a solid core of resolve that neither time nor pressure could dissolve. The siren still rang, brief and precise, but it was no longer just a sound of remembrance. It had become a line in the soil, a tone of refusal against manipulation disguised as civility. Karen, once composed and methodical in her pursuit of silence, now operated under a visible strain. Her smile, when it appeared, seemed thin and practiced, like a reflex disconnected from any genuine emotion. Her body language, once assertive and graceful, now bore the stiffness of someone who had been fighting a war of attrition and was beginning to feel the weight of it. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and by the time both parties arrived, the atmosphere outside the courthouse felt less like the preamble to a neighborly dispute and more like the threshold of a final reckoning. Inside, the courtroom filled slowly, not with crowds or cameras, but with observers from the county, local officials, and a few residents who had grown weary of the conflict and wanted to see it resolved. The judge, the same one who had overseen the prior motions, entered with a level of fatigue in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't interested in pageantry. This was the last session he would allow on the matter. Colleen opened with a quiet but firm delivery of Ethan's side, not by listing more technical data, but by outlining the pattern that had emerged, a deliberate, calculated campaign of escalation designed to force her client into compliance through emotional pressure and bureaucratic overreach. She submitted statements from 2 new witnesses, neighbors who had previously remained neutral but had since come forward with accounts of subtle intimidation and retaliatory behavior after expressing support for Ethan. One described how her fence had been vandalized the day after she spoke favorably about Ethan in a community meeting. The other, Henry, whose footage of Karen's audio interference devices had already become part of the record, now appeared in person, speaking quietly about how 2 individuals from her property had been seen on his land at night, adjusting equipment and erasing boot tracks in wet soil. It was no longer speculative, it was demonstrable, visible, recorded. Karen's legal team attempted to regain footing by returning to her original position: emotional distress, disruption of quality of life, her desire for a harmonious soundscape. But the courtroom felt different now. The narrative had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The judge interrupted the closing argument to ask a direct question. How many separate agencies have received formal complaints from your client against this defendant? The attorney hesitated, then replied, 7. The judge followed with another. How many were verified? The answer, none, officially. Then came the final blow, not from Ethan, not from Colleen, but from a subpoenaed technical report issued by the FCC 3 days before the hearing, confirming that the high-frequency interference recorded on Ethan's property had originated from a registered device belonging to a company partially owned by Karen Sterling, filed under a shell LLC used for audio consultancy. The courtroom fell into stillness as the judge read the paragraph aloud. Karen didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply lowered her eyes to the table as her attorney reached to whisper something near her ear, his voice tight and urgent. The judge adjourned the hearing temporarily and called both legal teams into chambers. For 30 minutes, Ethan sat outside the room on a bench, watching a patch of sunlight creep along the floor tiles as time dragged forward in slow motion. When Colleen returned, her face bore no smile, but her tone was steady. "He's issuing a permanent restraining order," she said. "She is barred from contacting you, your property, your neighbors regarding your land. She'll be fined for filing fraudulent environmental complaints and the audio interference. The FCC may pursue further charges. It's over, Ethan, on paper anyway." Ethan nodded slowly, his throat dry, his body still coiled from weeks of restraint. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt sober, aware of what it had cost to get here, not in money or legal hours, but in mental presence, in being forced to treat every moment of peace as something to defend like territory. Karen left the building through a side entrance. No confrontation, no final words, no glare across the parking lot. Just a black SUV rolling away into the distance, windows tinted, her silhouette barely visible in the back seat. Ethan remained on the bench a little longer, until the hallway emptied. He finally rose and walked out into the late morning air, where the trees whispered against the wind, and the courthouse steps echoed under his boots. Back home, the barn was as he left it. Quiet, orderly, untouched by the chaos it had briefly come to symbolize. He stepped inside, crossed to the control panel, and turned the system off for the night. Not as a gesture of surrender, but as a mark of transition. The Siren had done its part. Its presence had drawn the boundary, held the line. Now it could rest. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip behind the western ridge and the fields glowed gold beneath the lengthening shadows, Ethan stood on the porch with a coffee mug in hand, not filled with coffee but something darker, sharper, suited for closure. He looked toward the barn and the bell above it, still bolted firmly into its post, untouched through all of it. And then, for the first time in weeks, he pulled the cord. The bell rang once, deep and clean, the sound carrying like a breath held too long, then released with quiet reverence. No retaliation, no warning, no statement. Just memory, and the echo of a man who had refused to be moved by noise disguised as law. That was the sound that remained. That was the victory no document could record. In the weeks that followed, the tension that had once seemed stitched into the very soil of Ethan's land began to loosen, not with a celebratory rupture, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible release, like frost retreating from deep ground in early spring. Karen's absence was not marked by silence. Ethan had never feared silence, but by the sudden disappearance of resistance, the absence of that daily, unspoken pressure that had colored even the simplest routines. There were no more unmarked packages, no more parked SUVs at the ridge, no more late-night electrical failures or phantom frequencies weaving into the edge of hearing. The land resumed its original cadence, and for the first time in months, Ethan found himself working without looking over his shoulder or glancing at the motion sensor app every time a deer passed through the field. The restraining order held. Karen sold the house 2 weeks after the ruling, quietly, through a management company with a neutral name. No one said where she went, no moving truck ever came. One day she was simply gone. The fence still standing, but the windows of the house dark, the yard abandoned to weeds that returned quicker than one might expect. Ethan didn't speak of her again, not because he carried bitterness, but because she no longer occupied space in his world. She had tried to claim silence through dominance, and in failing, had left behind only the memory of her noise. Life did not return to what it had been before, not entirely. There were layers now, habits of caution, systems of documentation, redundancies in place that Ethan chose to keep. The cameras remained, though the alerts slowed to almost nothing. The Siren, once a symbolic act of resistance, was retired from daily use, stored in a sealed cabinet in the barn, its final purpose fulfilled. The bell remained, of course, and rang once each morning and once each evening, as it always had. The tone never changed, only the weight behind it. Now, when it echoed across the hills, it did so with a clarity that no longer needed defense. There was peace again, but it was the peace earned through resistance. Not gifted, not temporary, not conditional. It was held in place by every record kept, every line drawn, every moment Ethan had chosen to stay present rather than retreat. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began to reappear, first with quiet waves from their trucks as they passed, then with brief visits to exchange tools or ask about well repairs. One afternoon, Henry brought a cooler of fish and a bottle of rye as a thank you, not just for what Ethan had endured, but for proving that it was possible to stand firm without becoming cruel. Others followed. No speeches, no rallies, no vindication. Just the slow return of mutual respect in a community that had nearly been carved into silence by one person's obsession with control. Ethan didn't change much about himself in the aftermath. He still rose before the sun, still repaired what others might replace, still read the same worn volumes of poetry and mechanical manuals on alternating nights. But there was a new steadiness in how he moved, a quiet certainty that came from knowing where the lines were and what it took to defend them without losing yourself in the process. Sometimes he would sit on the porch at dusk, watching the wind move through the trees, the sun settling behind the hills, and he would think not of Karen, not even of the fight, but of Marcus and the reason the bell had been hung in the first place. It wasn't to be heard. It was to be remembered. When spring came fully, the ground softened and green returned to the ridge. The house Karen once occupied was bought by a quiet couple from out west who didn't ask about its history and never once commented on the bell. Ethan met them once at the feed store, exchanged names, shook hands, and let them settle without inquiry. They never